screaming. I will moderate my voice now that everyone will put their headsets on. Thank you and welcome to our session. My name is Jim Prendergast. I'll be serving as your moderator today, both online and offline. I will be handling sort of questions here in the room as well as questions online. In case you haven't figured it out, you're in the session titled Better Products and Policies Through Stakeholder Engagement. We've got a great group of panelists for you this afternoon. And it's great to be back at the Internet Governance Forum, which is an annual event that really does embody stakeholder engagement. If you're not on channel 4, that's the channel you need to be on in the room. Sorry about that. So the digital age presents us with incredible opportunities, but also significant challenges. As technology evolves, it becomes increasingly clear that products and policies cannot be created in isolation. They require collaboration and input from a diverse group of stakeholders, from civil society, academia, to private sector, policymakers, and communities that are directly affected by these innovations. Stakeholder engagement is more than just gathering input. It's about fostering dialogue. It's about building trust and co-creating solutions that are technically robust, socially inclusive, and aligned with universal human rights and principles. When done well, this approach can lead to outcomes that are not only innovative, but also sustainable and impactful. Today, we're joined by a great panel of experts who are going to share their insights and have been at the forefront of these efforts. First, we have Richard Wingfield, who's the Director of Technology and Human Rights at BSR. He's going to discuss how stakeholder involvement can align products with society values. I'm going to hit pause because can we get the presentation on Zoom? There we go. Thank you. We're having a little bit of problems with the slides. Can just go to the next slide. We thought we had all the technical issues worked out yesterday, but clearly we have not. All right, I'm going to continue to introduce our panelists, and we'll get to the next slide. So after Richard, we'll hear from Tobekele Matimbe, Senior Manager for Partnerships and Engagements at the Paradigm Initiative. She will share insights into the role of external expertise in policy development. And after that, we will have Charles Bradley, who's Manager of Knowledge and Information at Google. He will share lessons learned from fostering consumer trust through engagement. And then finally, we have Fiona Alexander, who's the Distinguished Policy Strategist in Residence, and she is in residence here in the room with me at American University. And she brings a governmental perspective from her time with the U.S. Department of Commerce. So before we dive in, I want to encourage everyone to actively participate, whether you're here in the room or online. We think that, your perspectives, your thoughts, and your questions will make this a much better session, a much more robust session. So let's get started by hearing from our panelists. First, I'm going to go to Richard, who will help us set the stage for this session by discussing the framework that he and BSR have developed. Richard?
Great. Thank you very much, Jim, and really good to be part of this session. I'm sorry that I can't be with you all in person there. So my name is Richard Wingfield, and I'm the Director of Technology and Human Rights at BSR. And BSR is a global sustainability organization. We work with hundreds of the world's largest companies on a spectrum of sustainability topics, everything from addressing climate change and environmental impacts to human rights. And I sit on our human rights team and lead our work with technology companies on how to act responsibly as a company and to build products and services that align with international human rights standards. So really pleased to be part of this conversation because stakeholder engagement is a critical part of the way we work with companies at BSR. And the approach that we take is very much in line with a number of existing frameworks and standards that exist in relation to stakeholder engagement. And for companies, whether in the technology sector or any other sector who are looking to be responsible businesses, to build trust and confidence, to align with what being a responsible business means. One of the most critical frameworks that is used and where we draw our inspiration from is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So the idea that states have human rights responsibilities is one that is well established in international law, in various international treaties. But in the last few decades, there was increasing concern from a number of external stakeholders that businesses also should be taking a role in making sure that the human rights of people affected by their businesses were respected as well. And that resulted about 15 years ago in the endorsement by the United Nations Human Rights Council of this framework called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So this is the framework that sets out what business and human rights looks like. It has various obligations that are imposed on states in terms of regulation of businesses. It imposes responsibilities on businesses to respect human rights. And it also imposes expectations as to how individuals who have been adversely affected can seek a remedy for any harm that has been suffered. And the most critical part of the UN Guiding Principles as a framework when it comes to businesses is that pillar that is specifically about how businesses should respect human rights. Now, the reason why I'm sort of mentioning this framework in a conversation around stakeholder engagement is because the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights make regular and explicit recognition of the importance of stakeholder engagement and meaningful stakeholder engagement when it comes to companies behaving responsibly. And this exists in a number of different aspects. One of the things that we do a lot of work with companies at BSR is to try to think through the way that companies have human rights impacts at all. And those can be risks to human rights. So, for example, the way the use or misuse of a particular technology might cause harm to somebody, perhaps restrictions on their freedom of expression or impacts upon their rights to privacy. We also look at the way that companies can advance human rights, the way that different technologies can be developed and used in ways which advances societal goals, for example, supporting freedom of expression or enabling education or improving healthcare. So looking at the way that the actual technological products and services can sort of both improve but also create risks to human rights. But we also look at the way that companies' own policies are also relevant here. And obviously, companies' policies are pretty instrumental in the way that technologies are designed, the way they are used. And these can be everything from a company's AI principles, which might govern the way that it develops and uses AI. If we were looking at social media or online platforms, the rules that they impose as to how people can and cannot use the platform in different ways. So there are a range of different ways that companies can sort of have impacts upon human rights. And what the guiding principles say is that in trying to understand those impacts, you need to speak to the people who are actually ultimately affected. So when we're working with a company at BSR, we put a huge amount of effort into, alongside the company, talking to and working with stakeholders to understand the risks that might be connected to a particular company. So what's happening in practice in different parts of the world and with different communities, the opportunities that can be provided. So the way that different technologies are being used in ways that can create benefit for communities, but also the company's own policies. So the way that the rules that the company sets relating to how they develop and use technology, or the way that users can and cannot use those technologies, how they might also themselves be having impacts upon human rights. So what does this look like in practice? So one of the complicating aspects of technology as a sector is that so many people are affected, and often the impacts of technology are global in nature. So if you're looking at a large online platform that might be used by people across the world, potentially hundreds of millions or even billions of people across the world, that's a huge number of people who might potentially be affected by the way that that service operates or by the rules that that company imposes. And so we really try to prioritize our stakeholder engagement with the communities that are most likely to be at risk. So we know, for example, that there are certain groups around the world who are particularly vulnerable to human rights harms. We know, for example, that persons with disabilities, for example, have historically been marginalized, may not be able to access or use technologies in the same way. We know that certain groups are vulnerable to things like hate speech or other types of harmful content online, particularly minority groups. We know that there are certain groups who might be vulnerable to discrimination or bias when it comes to AI systems because of the lack of data that was used connected to that group when those AI systems were created. So we try to prioritize our stakeholder engagement by working with those communities and groups that are going to be particularly affected by the risk or particularly vulnerable to that risk. And so that might mean working with women's rights organizations. It might mean working with organizations that support persons with disabilities. It might mean working with groups representing those who are vulnerable to discrimination within different societies. But we also know that the ways that technologies are used and the ways that the rules that companies impose can be felt very differently in different parts of the world. There are different cultural contexts. There are different language issues depending on the company and the primary language that it uses. There are different levels of digital literacy in different parts of the world, and so familiarity with technology and the way that it can be used or misused. So we also try to make sure that we take a global approach to our engagement with stakeholder, and that we talk with groups that can either speak to the experience of people in different parts of the world, or in some cases, we talk directly to groups in certain parts of the world where their experiences may be different from elsewhere. And so that's the kind of approach that we take to stakeholder engagement, is really trying to, particularly when you have potentially hundreds of millions or billions of people who are using a platform or affected by a technology, prioritizing our engagement with those groups who are going to be most vulnerable or most at risk, but also making sure that we are geographically and culturally diverse so that we hear the full range of experiences and can provide recommendations that are nuanced appropriately. What the UN guiding principles don't give a lot of detail on, however, is the actual mechanics of stakeholder engagement. So yes, they talk about the importance of talking to a diverse range of stakeholders and meaningfully using what they tell you in the way that the company develops its technology or it creates or modifies its rules, but it doesn't really tell you how to do it in practice. And so we use a range of different ways depending on the company we're working with and the issue in question. So it can be something like organizing one-on-one interviews. So we might just simply organize a number of sort of one-on-one interviews with different organizations around the world. We ask them questions, we talk to them about their concerns. We might get into some specificity about a particular rule or a particular product, depending on the work that we're doing in question. We might also organize workshops where we bring together a broader range of people, and sometimes that can be helpful because then you have a diversity of opinions within a room and people are able to counter each other or raise different perspectives or push back, and so you get much more of a dialogue. So sometimes we'll use workshops or those broader interviews as a way of seeking engagement as well. We also know that there is a lot of stakeholder fatigue as an issue. So a lot of stakeholders constantly being asked to participate in interviews and meetings. So we also try to use existing spaces where people are talking about the issues that concern them. And the IGF is a great example of that. There are other conferences around the world like RightsCon, TrustCon, the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. So there are many existing spaces where NGOs and other stakeholders come and talk about the issues that are most important to them, including the impacts of different technologies and different technology companies. And so quite often we will come to these events, run sessions ourselves, participate in other sessions, and use that as an opportunity of hearing directly from people on the ground. So we use a variety of different tactics and techniques to ensure that we are not only talking to a broad range of people, but also not adding additional burden and time to them, but using existing spaces wherever possible. What the UN guiding principles also don't give a lot of guidance on is how you then incorporate that feedback back into company decision making. So, and I'm sure perhaps some of our company colleagues on this call will speak to, decision making at a company is not a straightforward exercise. The design and the creation of new technology products, the way they're launched, the way the policies are created and modified, these are complex processes. And so it's not always straightforward simply to take the results of one interview or one workshop back and then to very quickly and easily make changes as a result of it. Stakeholder engagement and the feedback received will be one of a number of different sources of input into the ultimate decision making of a company. So what we at BSR try to do is to make the feedback that we get from stakeholders as practical as possible. We try to make sure that it's very clear in exactly what stakeholders would like to see from the company and how that can be measured and assessed in time. One of the things that we also try to do is to build long-lasting relationships between companies and stakeholders as well. So simply bringing in one organization for one interview at a point in time and then never speaking to them again does not encourage a sort of a long-standing and trusted relationship. So we often try to make sure that companies are providing updates to the stakeholders on what's happened, involving them in later decision making, and trying to create relationships rather than something which is merely transactional. So the UN Guiding Principles as a framework is a really helpful starting point in setting out that companies should engage with stakeholders. This should be used to understand the company's risk profile, but also where there might be opportunities as well, and ensuring that there is a diversity of opinions in terms of the range of stakeholders that you speak to and the nuance that you get from those engagements. And then at BSR, we've tried to add a bit more practicality to that framework in terms of what those engagements look like in practice and how we make sure that they are meaningful and impactful rather than transactional. So that's the approach that we take. Jim, maybe I'll pass back to you for our next speaker at this point.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Richard. So yeah, turning to our next speaker, Tobakile, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. One of the things that Richard talked about was going to various fora where stakeholders are, and I know you're heavily involved with DRIFT, which is the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum. Could you share with us sort of your take on this, the concept of stakeholder engagement, and maybe any outcomes from that conference that may be relevant to our discussion today?
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. I'm Tobegile Matimbe, and I work for Paradigm Initiative, which is an organization that promotes digital rights and digital inclusion across the African continent and within the Global South. And I work for PIN as Senior Manager Partnerships and Engagements. So this is a very important conversation around stakeholder engagement. And I'm happy that Richard was able to unpack the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and what they say with regards to corporate responsibility, which is something that is critical. And one of the key things, that point towards adherence with corporate responsibility is obviously stakeholder engagement as something that is critical to ensuring that we have better products that are out there and that also take into consideration human rights. So as I reflect on, that topic on stakeholder engagements and better products, it's important to articulate that it is important, I think, for the private sector to sort of, within their, quest for due diligence, to be able to think about what stakeholder engagement looks like. And from where I'm sitting, I think for me, one thing that I would echo is the importance of meaningful stakeholder engagement and not just tokenistic stakeholder engagement where, it's just sort of like ticking the boxes, but how can engagements become more and more meaningful? And thinking about it is, it's so important for companies to think about how they can meet the community where they are, as opposed to perhaps, scheduled meetings that come in once off, probably as a way of transactions. I think Richard just mentioned transactional engagements, but more proactive, strategies to actually meet the community where they are. And that's what DRIFT is. The Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum is a platform that Paradigm Initiative hosts annually, and we're looking forward to hosting the 12th edition in Lusaka, Zambia next year, from 29 April to 1 May. But what happens at DRIFT, which is the acronym for the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum, is that we have multi-stakeholder engagements where we have different actors coming into the room to discuss trends and developments in the digital rights space. And we have governments come in, we have civil society organizations, the media, technologists, companies as well. But we've not seen as much companies coming on board to engage with the community. This year alone, we held the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum in Accra, Ghana, and we had just almost 600 participants who were there, and from not just Africa, but over around 40 countries that were at DRIF, and we had attendees from Africa and Global South spaces as well. So it's a really rich platform where any product designer would want to be there to be able to engage with the community, interface, and discuss products. But thinking about it, the key players really, with regards to better products, these would be those who use the products. And that's why I'm saying that it's important for companies to think proactively about engaging with those who use their products, to be able to flag out what they think about when they are designing products, and how they can even improve those products better. And what better place than to be in platforms where there are different stakeholders that can be able to input into the design process of technology. I would also highlight that one critical thing in the design process is obviously the do no harm principle, especially in the context of human rights. And who are those who are bearing the brand of bad products that are unleashed on the market? It's the users of those technologies, those who are probably marginalized groups, those are minority groups, and their voices can only be heard in spaces where human rights are discussed, even discussing as well persons with disabilities, what are their challenges. And this is why I think it's important for more and more companies to find themselves in platforms where there are such conversations happening, and DRIF is one such platform. And I think one key thing when we're looking at policies themselves, maybe community standards, for instance, if we're looking at social media platforms, would find that they come up with community standards, and it's always important to circle back to the community and say, this is what we have. Is it still fit for purpose? Because technology does not wait, it's fast evolving. So it's important as well to always have that interface with the community proactively. And I'll give an example that for us as Paradigm Initiative, just recently, we had a very interesting engagement with one telecommunications company that reached out to us after seeing one of our reports that were done on surveillance in Africa, and they were so keen, and they laid their hands on this research, and they literally reached out and requested a meeting with us, which was a proactive action, as opposed to a probably reactionary stakeholder engagement process, where perhaps if we had written to them and said, look, there's this challenge that we've seen that this has happened in this country based on your product, but they were proactive in terms of reaching out to us and say, let's have a conversation. And it was I would say one of our best engagements with the private sector, especially around community standards. And I think, as policies are being developed by different private sector actors, it's important to always figure out where is the community that uses our product, where can we get to, how can we reach the community to be able to get feedback on what we are churning out, so that we strengthen what we develop, and we put out something that is good and robust and rights respecting, mitigating as well human rights impacts. It's also important as well to reflect on some of the outputs that have come from the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum. So every year we come up with community recommendations, and we gather these from the people who attend the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum from across underserved communities across the Global South, and they give input. And I think for the private sector, what has been clear is that need for that engagement around policies and how they are developed to better strengthen security and safety. When we're talking about trust as well, and safety is something that is critical to the context of products and how they can be better and better serve the users themselves. So I think one thing as well that I would highlight that has also come up is the importance of having policies that ensure that vulnerable groups as well are not left behind. So you have your human rights defenders or your media who feel that sometimes when policies are being developed, they are not really addressing some of the lived realities that they face. So I think reflecting more on the do no harm principle is something that I would really want to echo. It's something that is really important, and it's actually something that should be embedded at every point of the product design process. So it's really critical that we continue to have this conversation and also hear from colleagues within the private sector as well with regards to their views as well around proactive stakeholder engagement as opposed to stakeholder engagements that are reactive or just a ticking of the boxes, and what they are doing as well to ensure that they are able to meet the community where the community is. And it's something as well that I'll highlight even as I conclude my reflections, that due diligence is something that demonstrates corporate responsibility, is important primarily as a corporate practice towards better products that within themselves respect human rights and echo the importance of mitigating human rights impact. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. And I'll post in the chat as well the link to more about the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum. And currently we actually have a call that's out for session proposals. So, that's a good opportunity for those in the private sector who would want to engage around their products or discuss more about them with the community to be able to possibly consider being at the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum in Lusaka, Zambia next year, so that we continue to have meaningful, proactive stakeholder engagements.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. Now we're going to turn the perspective a little bit away from product development to policy development. Fiona, who's sitting across the table from me here in the room, you spent a long time at the Department of Commerce. I've known you for a long time, and you were heavily engaged in stakeholder engagement. I think the U.S. government has been a leader in that aspect. So can you share with us sort of what you found worked with stakeholder engagement when it comes to developing government policies, and maybe what didn't?
Sure, happy to. And let me turn one ear off, so maybe I'll take both off. It's hard to hear yourself when you're talking. So thanks, Jim, for inviting me, and to everyone remotely. You're missing a beautiful venue, so sorry you're not here to join us in person for today's conversation. But as Jim mentioned, I was at the Department of Commerce in the U.S. government for about 20 years. And, in terms of the conversation for today about better policy, from my perspective through stakeholder engagement, I think it's important to note, at least in the U.S. government system, there's a couple different ways and processes that are used. So for regulation and under our regulatory regimes, our legislature will pass a law, but our independent regulators or other parts of the government will actually do a lot of stakeholder engagement to actually produce the specifics of how a law is implemented through regulation. And we actually have a pretty prescribed process for that through the Administrative Procedures Act, where actually a particular agency will get an assignment, they'll have to put draft rules out, or they'll do a notice of proposed rules, and there's pretty formulaic 45 days, 90 days, stakeholder feedback, that kind of stuff. And that's on the sort of regulatory side in the United States, and that's across sectors. So it's not just technology sectors, but all of our sector regulatory approaches work that way. Where it becomes a little bit more flexible and a little bit different is with respect to broader policy setting. And in the agency that I worked at in the Department of Commerce, NTIA is a big proponent and has been historically of the multi-stakeholder model in places like the IGF and things like that. But we also talk about government as a convener. So there's the idea of similarly seeking public input or stakeholder engagement on what should be the priorities and policies of your office or your administration. Sometimes you do a public meeting, sometimes you do a notice of inquiry and you ask for written feedback. And the outcome of these efforts is really, government policy setting or government priority setting, and it impacts what the team does and how advocacy happens across different parts of the world or bilateral engagement. But then there's also government as a convener in terms of actually trying to set policy or participate in policy. And I had the great experience of being involved and responsible for the U.S. government's relationship with ICANN. So I was very much involved in the IANA stewardship transition, which is a big, probably one of the largest examples of a multi-stakeholder decision-making process versus a multi-stakeholder consultation process. And in that regard, we were sort of instrumental in setting some of the key foundational principles, participating in the process, and actually evaluating it. But something that's probably not as well known in this environment is at the time, NTIA actually tried to deploy sort of a multi-stakeholder decision-making process domestically, and it was much more challenging actually than it was globally. And the example I give is we were trying to actually implement some sort of baseline privacy rights without congressional legislation. And in the absence of that, tried to convene stakeholders and actually said, okay, what should we be talking about? And what do you all want to talk about? And what policies do you all want to set? And I will say the very first meeting of that was very strange for a lot of people because they were much more used to what I described at the outset, the Administrative Procedures Act, where government comes in and says, here's the particular problem we're trying to solve. Here's some of our initial thinking. What do you think? In this case, we were like, nope, my boss at the time, we're going to let the stakeholders decide. What do they want to focus on? What rules do they want to set? And that those processes were much more uneven. Some yielded some specific, voluntary codes around mobile apps transparency, but a couple of those stakeholder processes actually fell apart. And I think it was a learning experience, I think, for the team, but didn't yield any actual policy outcomes because the stakeholders themselves didn't have a particular focus that they wanted to talk about. So again, I think when we're talking about better policies through stakeholder engagement, some of the lessons learned, at least from my experience, depending on how you're handling it, and setting aside again our required regulatory approach. But if you're going to try to deploy a multi-stakeholder process, or if you're going to try to do stakeholder engagement, it's better when you have a targeted question you're asking people, just like when you're developing a particular product. If you're developing a particular policy and helps people focus, that tends to be a little bit more useful. At least in the governmental sense, there's got to be political will to actually want to follow this approach, because there's a lot of people that will challenge the approach, and there's a lot of people that, when they don't get exactly what they want from the approach, will try to go around you or go to other parts of the government to get what they want. So there's strong commitment to political will is an important thing. You've got to also, as someone else mentioned as well, it can't just be a check-the-box exercise. You actually have to always be talking to people. It can't just be, okay, I have this particular problem, I'm going to talk to you now. You've got to build relationships, and you've got to sustain the relationships, and you've got to actually keep working with people so that you understand each other and can talk. There's also got to be enough resources, not just in the sense of stakeholders being able to participate, which can be a challenge if you want a broad range of stakeholders. Not everybody's resourced the same. The same is true of governments. So you've got to actually have enough staff and enough people and resources to do them. And then again, I go back to, at least in my experience, where better policy through stakeholder engagement has occurred when the questions have been a little bit more focused and the problem set has been a little bit more narrow. When you have a broad problem set, I think it lends itself to inertia sometimes, and it's hard to get past some of the different competing perspectives. The other thing that helps is having a deadline. If there's a clear deadline, it drives people to particular outcomes, and that was kind of my takeaway from my experiences. And maybe I'll end there and keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And, as you were speaking and giving some of your best practices, I could see Charles reacting on screen, deadlines and political will. And, so let's flip it back to product development. I see you reacting to a lot of what Fiona says. Why don't you share with us some of your experiences at Google in the product development lifecycle and this engagement process that you've undertaken?
Absolutely, yeah. So hi everyone, I'm Charles. I'm the manager for trust strategy on knowledge and information products here at Google. So just a bit of context of what on earth that means. Knowledge and information products are our search, maps, news, Gemini products, so anything that connects people with information rather than our hardware or cloud work. And manager of trust strategy, well, our role in our team is to shape our products and our product strategy so that we continue to build trust with users. Sort of a department that was built about 3 or 4 years ago, and a fundamental part of that is our stakeholder engagement. We built a program at Google called our External Expert Research program, which was all about ensuring that we get meaningful expertise into the product development lifecycle in a company that's moving at 1 million miles an hour at all times. We, having been on the other side of this conversation for many years now, I totally understand some of the challenges that have been raised by my fellow panelists. I was one of the stakeholders who's fatigued about being asked the same questions by different companies over and over. I was also one of the stakeholders who sort of would come to consultations and be like, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. You've been thinking about this question for 3 years and you're asking me to split a hair on something in 15 minutes. Maybe a bit of context would have been helpful, and you could have helped me sort of understand the problems to base a little bit more. So I think that might be why I was hired in the first place, was to try and bring a bit of that understanding from the stakeholder perspective into the product development lifecycle, which is at Google run by product managers and engineers who are trying to build and ship products to millions and billions of users. So when we come along and say, hey, we need to be speaking to a wider range of expertise, often we get sort of flags being flown of that's going to slow us down. How do we get product market fit faster, et cetera, et cetera. So the program was built as a way of showing that if we do this right at the beginning, our products will be more successful, and we'll build greater trust when they launch, rather than having to build that over time. And I want to talk about two sort of examples that we've done in 2024, which has been quite an exciting year for us in this space. Firstly, it was on Circle to Search. Circle to Search is a new feature available on Android, where on any surface on an Android device, you can long hold the bar at the bottom and circle a bit of your screen, and that will send a search up to Google Search. Why is this useful? Well, people are finding information in many different ways. They're looking for access to information, not just coming to search directly anymore, but coming from different platforms. And we thought it was a great way of like meeting users where they're at. So if you're on a video somewhere, or you're on some other piece of content and you want to know a bit more about that, why can't you just circle it and off you go? Well, there were a number of key risks to launching this product, including some of the privacy risks you could imagine associated with it. So our product manager, who's leading this, is very familiar with some of these risks, and forced a opening in the product development lifecycle to ensure that we went out and got expert feedback. And we got expert feedback through a number of one-on-one consultations to start with. So thinking through what Richard was talking about in terms of like formats. The format of engagement has been very important to ensure that we can get direct and specific feedback from individuals, as well as group feedback. So we went out and spoke to dozens of experts in human-computer interaction, as well as privacy and human rights experts. And then we went and after a few one-on-one engagements with these experts, we also brought them together in a group setting. And we came back with 5 key themes, which actually led to amendments to the product. So the first issue that we heard was, how do you prevent unintentional feature activation or sharing of data? So if you don't want to have this product on your phone, how can we stop that from unintentionally opening us, sharing data with you? So we ensured that there was explicit user action to launch and to actually activate the product, rather than it being auto on. And we also provided access in the search itself to delete that search, because we wanted to make sure that people had the closest control to deletion. We also heard how do we ensure that users can access the controls over this information as well. So we integrated a delete the last 15 minutes search, which is something that we're trying to do more broadly across a number of our products. We understand that deleting your whole search history might not be what you want to do, but you may have searched for something that might be a present for someone, or it might be a more sensitive query that you want to be able to quickly delete your last 15-minute search. So we integrated that as a feature. Meaningful disclosure. So what on earth is going on? How do we ensure that there's meaningful consent to what's happening with this product, and how do we educate users? So in the first launch of the product, we provide a lot more clear language explanation of what this product is and how it works, and we provide much clearer control and consent to how we're using your data. One thing that one risk that also came up, so the fourth of the 5 points, was around facial recognition technology. So we use visual search a lot in this. This is like our Lens product you may have come across before. And people were very worried that we were going to be using sort of biometric technologies for this. We don't use biometric technologies. We're using a similar image-to-image matching service. So if this picture is available in the open web, it's indexed, and then we'll be able to find you a similar copy of that. But we don't know who that person is, and we're not taking a photo of Charles Bradley and saying, "Oh, I know that's Charles Bradley. Let me return you other photos of him." It's purely on a visual match-to-match basis, and we're explaining that with users. And then what information are we using and what data are we sort of storing when this product is being invoked was one of the key points as well. So the whole point of the circling part of it is that users can precisely select a part of their phone that they want to search for. Nothing outside of that search is used or collected in the process. And what we're doing here is actually turning, if it's an image, we're turning that image into text, or we're using the text to create a search. And that text is stored as part of your search history, but no other information is stored. So we're not taking the photo of it and storing that photo against your account or anything else. We're just using the text that we've generated from that. So these were sort of 5 like really critical things that came up through these engagements, and I think the team had a good sense of some of these issues, but not the level of priority to some of them. And I think for the stakeholder engagement, we were able to more clearly develop sort of escape hatches or solutions for users, which met users' needs. So providing control front and center in the product as you're using it, rather than back in a setting or some account profile, which is often how products provide you with control over search history and everything else. So it really fundamentally changed the way in which we launched this product and has resulted in a really good launch for us. And a product that's been used quite a lot over the last few years. So that's one example where we've done a very specific product development thing. And I think to sort of some of Fiona's points, we had a very clear deadline. We had a very clear problem statement and scope. We were looking to launch this product, and we were looking for ways in which we could build it more sustainably and more suitably for users. Another example, which I'll use just to sort of show some of the other strategies that we have, is our work on AI overviews. So now if you go to search, you may see an AI overview where we generate a response to your query using generative AI, and then below that provide you with 10 blue links. This is something that we launched about 14 months ago in beta in labs, which is our beta opt-in service on search, and have recently rolled out to over 100 markets. But when doing so, we knew that there were going to be a number of broader challenges to sensitive queries. So things that may not be a very straight line answer to a factual response. There obviously we apply our product policies to ensure that we don't trigger an AI overview on something that is policy prohibitive. So be that about illegal activity or hate speech, etc. But there are obviously a number of grey area queries where we could, with Google Voice and our point of view, provide a less than suitable answer to that. And to do this, we didn't really have a very clear sense of what the product strategy should be and how we should do this, because it's such a new and evolving space. So we built a panel of experts that we are now in the 2nd year of engaging, and we work with on a monthly basis, either through one-on-ones, through online virtual calls, or through in-person meetings, who are giving us much higher level advice around the product strategy and direction, as well as providing clear guidance on when we have quite specific questions to ask them about whether we should respond in this way, or what frameworks we should be using to train our models to respond here. I think the benefit of this has been that it's such a complicated space that asking us, an expert, one or two 1 hour calls, we would be really underutilizing the expertise of these experts. There was quite a large ramp up to build a clear and consistent understanding amongst our experts of what our ultimate challenges were with this, how is the model actually being trained, and what different strategies do we have within our model and product launch strategy do we have at our disposal, and then going iteratively across a number of these, looking at different verticals of sensitive queries, stack ranking them and working through some of those strategies has been very, very fruitful. And I know that the experts that we've worked with in this program have found it very rewarding, because not only can they see some of their work sort of directly being integrated into the product and being launched, and we've now had many billions of queries trigger AI overviews now, but also they get to sort of learn about the different strategies that we're focusing on, and some of their expert work is actually based on this, but they've never had the opportunity to integrate that within a business context. So there's two things within the program. We've now done about 30 studies this year, and we're sort of focused on a number of areas for next year. And always we can do a better job, but we think we're sort of moving in the right direction to provide clarity over how we integrate experts into product development. Pass you back to you, Jim.
Great, Charles. Thanks a lot. It's really interesting to see how the product development lifecycle did take into account the outside expertise and feedback. And I can only imagine your engineers looking at you saying, "Are you kidding me? You want to do this on the front end?" But as you said, it probably saved time, and it's a lot of aggravation in the long run. So for those in the room, we're gonna be moving to discussion and question and answer. We do have a couple of microphones up here. I can play Phil Donahue for you Americans who understand that reference, and move the microphone around. There's one up here on the table, but I'll sort of get the conversation going. I know, Richard, you engaged with Avri Doria in the chat. I just about a 5-step approach toolkit that you've developed. Do you want, just for those who aren't in the chat, you want to give a quick overview of what that is and how folks might be able to access it?
Yes, absolutely. So the approach is linked to in the chat, but you can also find it by using the search engine of your choice and looking up BSR Stakeholder Engagement 5-Step Approach. In short, the approach is, well, it's a toolkit that we've developed which helps companies think about how to approach stakeholder engagement. The steps are, first of all, developing a strategy. So basically setting out what you want to do as a company in terms of your vision for stakeholder engagement, your level of ambition, maybe reflecting on existing stakeholder engagement. This is obviously something that will vary depending on the resources of the company and what it wants to achieve through stakeholder engagement. Secondly, stakeholder mapping. So when I was talking earlier, I mentioned the kind of the breadth and diversity of stakeholders that exist, or people who might be affected by a company's products or policies. And so undertaking a mapping of which groups or organizations or individuals you need to speak to, and maybe where those relationships already exist. Third, preparation. And this is sort of coming back to some of the points that Charles and others have made around making sure that stakeholders are able to engage in that process with confidence and with an understanding of what's happening. So that's everything from building those relationships, thinking about what the logistics might be for those meetings, preparing and capacity building beforehand so that people can come to them and genuinely participate in a helpful way. The fourth stage is the actual engagement itself. And we provide some guidance there on how to manage difficult situations, for example, making sure that all voices are heard, in dealing with some of the barriers that might exist to stakeholder engagement relating to language or accessibility, for example. And then fifth, setting out an action plan as to how you're going to use the inputs for that engagement, either to make changes or just to make sure that people are kept in the loop about what's happening. So those are the 5 steps of the approach, and the toolkit is available via the link or just by searching BSR Stakeholder Engagement 5-Step Approach.
Great, thank you, Richard. Toba Kelly, a question for you. For many companies, Africa is an opportunistic market. It's a growing market. It's a place where they want to do business, but there are unique challenges to it as well. And what would you say are some of the challenges that for companies that want to engage in stakeholder engagement across the continent? What might they face, and what are your recommendations how they might overcome those?
Thanks. Africa is a very great place where there is room to engage with civil society actors on what they're facing, what the challenges are. But I think the challenge has been really, having more of, willpower from, private sector actors to actually want to meet with, the community on the ground to be able to engage on key challenges. Like I mentioned, we host the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum, and we'll have, there are definitely companies that will know will be there, will be in the room, we'll have Google in the room, we'll have Meta there to be able to engage. But we feel that, well, there's a whole lot of other private sector actors, who would want to be in the room. We really have had several actors that have been able to come through and be able to engage. But I think what is important to highlight is that the environment that we operate in on the African continent, it's marked by repressive governments that obviously have their own calls on companies, and they might want to also make certain orders even as well on companies. And that's the kind of challenging atmosphere environment that companies face when they come on the African continent willing to engage. But I think there's a way around it. I think that proactiveness in terms of stakeholder engagement will be able to ensure that even when there has been a challenge and companies have been forced to do certain things, or even not to be able to respond according to their policies effectively, to certain situations, they can still have a space to engage with actors on the African continent to say, what else can we do, and support other forms of strategies that civil society actors might be using to actually address some of the challenges that we face. So with regards to stakeholder engagement, there's a willing civil society space, and it's open, because I think the ways we've been engaging, the formats of engagement, they can always be adapted to context. So there is room to actually engage. I think what we need to see is more willpower from private sector actors to actually meet the community where the community is.
Great, thank you very much, and that's good insight and good advice. I'm going to look at Fiona and Charles virtually. I'm going to look at you. I'm going to ask you each, Fiona, from your perspective, talking to, well, as a former government official, speaking to other governments, what one key piece of advice would you give governments who are looking to engage in stakeholder advice? And Charles, yours would be, what piece of advice would you give to other private sector entities about going down this path?
Sorry. So I think I just might say that as I listen to others speak, and Charles in particular, I think it's easy or even natural, right? If you're the decision maker, whether you're a company making a product or a government making a policy, it's kind of natural to be like, I know best. I'm going to sit in my office and talk to my team, and I'm going to decide. And that's just a natural, I think, human way of thinking. It's really important, though, to take a step back and realize that even though talking to people might take more time, and if you're doing a multi-stakeholder process, it probably is a little bit messy. At the end of the day, you're going to get a better product or a better policy, and you're going to have buy-in if you actually take the time to talk to people in a meaningful way. And I think that's my advice to people, is to actually take that step back. And I'm not on my computer in front of me, so I don't know who's on, but you mentioned that Avery was on, and I don't know why, but it makes me think of that maybe sort of stakeholder engagement or participation almost needs ambassadors to make the case as to why this is actually the better way to do policy, and the better way to make product is to actually convince people that's the best way to do it. But I think it's natural to be like, I know best. I'm just going to make my own choice. And I think we realize that the outcome of that isn't always the best.
Great. Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of agree with all of that. I'll go one step further on the knowing best point. I think sometimes people do know that they need to do it, but there's just so many other pressures on time and some of the skills needed to be able to do this. I think there's a confidence issue as well with some people who are very familiar with engaging with different internal stakeholders, but not external stakeholders, and a concern about what they might hear or how they might get that feedback. I totally agree with Fiona's point around champions. I think the smartest thing that my boss did was like turn this into a formal program at Google, with like a high visibility and structure to it, so that we could like build champions underneath that program, and champions not just in like who are staffed to this program, but also champions in different parts of the business who have utilized the program and deliver greater products. We get all sorts of challenges from other product areas, as Jim alluded to, of you're going to make me want to do this beforehand, like why aren't we doing this down the line to see what actual like risks there are or harms there are, rather than like foreseeing them. And I think that once we've got a bunch of case studies within a formal program with a bunch of ambassadors, the sort of the inbound requests for this have really started to appear, and we have a number of sort of expert engagements at the moment that are underway, which came to us saying, "Oh, I really want to make sure that my product lands in the right way, and I know that you're a team that can do that, but you can also do that, at pace and inside the infrastructure of the business, and so it's internalizing it, creating a formal program, and then building champions who can drive up demand would be my advice."
Great, thank you very much. So you've created almost like a little cottage industry within Google on how to engage on this. So maybe a profit center someday. Turning to the audience, I know we have a question here. If anybody else has a question, let me know. I don't have eyes behind my head, so I don't think we have any there. Just do me a favor, just please identify who you are, and if you have a question directed to one of our panelists, just let them know. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Lena Slackmulder. I work with Search for Common Ground, which is an international peace-building organization, but I also co-chair the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion, which brings technologists, peace builders, academics, policy influencers to influence tech design for social cohesion. And listening to this panel, like each of you are saying things that are true, but I feel like there's some other truths that also need to be put on the table. And then I'm curious to hear what are some of your thoughts about those, right? And I want to say, Charles, that, just dovetailing from where you left it, like the rest of the industry has completely depleted trust teams. It's extraordinary that you've built it up and that you just said that, that your senior leadership is actually trying to incentivize this. Because this is the first thing I want to say, is that there is actually a de-incentive for this kind of engagement, even when organizations like Tobes and others are bringing forth the harms to these companies, right? They're basically saying it's not going to be prioritized over profit. We're looking for growth. We're looking for engagement. And to you, Richard, I wonder if you also feel like there is a real changing narrative in the sort of business and human rights space when it comes to big tech today. And that the things that are really leading to most of the changes, again, not in any way excluding, Charles, those excellent examples of how you've made change, but in most cases, the changes that the tech companies are making in their products is due to litigation, fear of fines, reputational damage, and things like that. And somehow, even with really good multi-stakeholderness, the companies are not necessarily interested in making these changes. And I'll go one step further, that in Africa, there's places where these companies are even trying to damage the reputations of organizations that are pointing out the harms of these products, right? They're using money to fund other groups that may be saying what they want to hear, and they're actually, damaging the other organizations that are being more critical. So even with multi-stakeholder engagement, there's something that's going really wrong when we look at big tech. And it's why, and I'll end with this, that we still see a number of products that, whether it's the chatbots, whether it's the Notify things, there's a whole range of products coming out on the market each week that are not doing an upstream test on safety, that are not being transparent. And without the transparency, again, what kind of stakeholder engagement are you really looking at, right? When you ask people for the consultations, you're not subsidizing them to give you all those consultations, right? So again, I'd just love to hear from the panelists. Are we recognizing that we're at a different time here? And even with all the good 5-step skills in multi-stakeholder consultations, there's still a real issue on the table here.
All right, who wants to go first on that one? Maybe Richard. Do you want to take it from the high level?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm hesitant to generalize too much by saying that all technology companies do or don't do something. I think there is huge variation in terms of maturity and attitude towards the importance of being a responsible business, with some taking that responsibility a lot more seriously than others, for sure. But I can understand why there is a sort of feeling that the overall the sector still hasn't done enough on this, and it still isn't doing enough. And I think one of the real challenging things, and I don't have a solution to this, is that meaningful stakeholder engagement takes a long time, and it requires organizations to be brought in at a very early stage. If you're a company with potentially thousands of different products that might be developed, some of which will never make it to market, you often don't know until a relatively late stage which ones are ultimately likely to launch or not. And by that point, it's very difficult to then bring stakeholders in, unless you want to exhaust them by constantly asking them about all of the different options that there might be at every single stage. And of course, technology moves so fast. And that when you've got, companies, and we think about generative AI and the rush for companies to make sure that they are leading on this as a new technology, bringing in stakeholder engagement slows the process down. And that's not to say that we shouldn't do it, but I'm just saying that there are ways that I think the technology sector faces unique challenges when it comes to meaningful stakeholder engagement, because it does run contrary to a number of other business interests potentially. So I think the solutions to that, and none of these are silver bullets. One is regulation, and we're seeing more regulation, particularly in the EU, which requires companies to engage with stakeholders as part of their risk assessment processes. Things like the EU's Digital Services Act, the AI Act, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Second is to make it easier for stakeholders to become engaged, and that might mean more sectorally focused engagement. So, for example, at BSR, we're now doing a human rights impact assessment into generative AI, which is across the sector's entirety. So not just individual companies, but working collectively to try to reduce the amounts and the demands on them. But there are some of those, as what you kind of call disincentives, that are really hard to work around, for sure. So I'm not going to pretend there isn't a problem there. But I do think there is huge variation still in terms of the approach that different companies take, with some doing it better than others, for sure.
Toba Kelly, anything to add?
Thanks. I would just say that I think from my earlier reflections, what I mentioned about willpower, I think on the part of companies to engage, and not just engage, but meaningfully engage, is something that we still as an organization are looking forward to experiencing more of. And more specifically as well, engaging where the community is, especially at community convenings, is something that we would love to see as well gain more traction. I think one thing that I would say is that what we have experienced, especially with engagements with the private sector company, is definitely those few that are willing to engage with us and that we engage with. It's usually engagements that, will have like side meetings, like closed meetings, and it's not out there where we are engaging with the broader communities that we represent or that we support and stand for. It's more of, okay, who are we going to engage with on the continent? Okay, there's this organization and that organization. But proactive stakeholder engagement is looking further than that and saying, hey, if you're reaching out to Paradigm and say, hey, Paradigm Initiative, we are working on the African continent. We would like to meet the community. Where can we meet the community? And we open it up to broader actors on the continent. I think there would be much more enriching conversations around the challenges that the communities are facing with regards to products, as well as better inputs into how to shape policies, even for big tech companies as well. So I think what we would definitely love to see is more interest in engaging, especially where the community is, meeting the community where it is, the broader community, and not just picking out or cherry picking those organizations that will know, okay, if we say we were in a room, we engaged with Paradigm, then tick, we've done our part. But we needed to be more meaningful and be able to as well address the concerns of the broader community on the African continent.
Thank you. Charles, obviously you can't speak for the industry, but what's your take from the Google standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that it's been raised. If it was very easy and if it was all going swimmingly, we probably wouldn't have our jobs trying to do this. I think there are two ways of seeing some of the more like harsh government actions over the last few years, where the increase in regulation, which has been like welcomed and important to ensure that decision making about the way in which products are developed and deployed to users is much more democratic and organized by nation states and regional bodies has been really important to see, and we're really encouraged by the stakeholder engagement that the different national governments and regional bodies have done there, as well as you mentioned, some of the fines. I mean, our view of this has been that we can either continue to wait for these fines and more regulation that may or may not be fit for purpose, or we can engage more with stakeholders to ensure that our products are more aligned with their expectations and the values that we're trying to inhibit. And that's actually been a strategy that's got a lot of traction at a leadership level. And as you say, that's not the case for every company, and we are very fortunate to be able to take a long-term view on this. But it has been sort of part of the business's DNA for a long time to be able to engage with stakeholders and bring that expertise into product development. I think we're just getting much sharper at doing so in a more meaningful way, i.e., actually showing impact at the product level. And there are, hundreds of success stories where products have never ever been launched because we have spoken to external stakeholders and experts who have given us very clear guidance on what the risks will be, which are way beyond the threshold of that we would be able to accept. But internally, we didn't see those issues. We didn't pattern match those or understand the trends there. So I think there are different viewpoints from different businesses. Obviously, our viewpoint is that with the increase of a harder government action in this space, we're going to end up with greater need for stakeholder engagement and building trust and safety into our products, rather than the opposite, where people are racing to get things out the door to try and get product market fit.
Thanks to all three of you. I'm looking around the room just to see if there are any other questions. I'm not seeing any hands. Oh, Fiona.
I might just respond a little bit to this one as well, because I think it's important, and I get the perspective that you're bringing, but there's no universal solution, and there's not a single path that will fix all of these things. All companies are slightly different. All products are very different. And not all products or policies are equal in terms of their purpose and their impact. And this is why frameworks, and the one that I think Richard mentioned, this is why frameworks can be useful, because then you can talk about how to implement those frameworks and how you can incentivize action and how to get to that. I will just say that the idea that regulation is going to solve all these problems, I think is slightly misguided. I think we've seen a lot of regulation emanate from Brussels in the last 5 years, and I think it's unclear yet what the implication of that regulation is going to be, how damaging it's going to be, how effective it's going to be, or if it's going to be good. So I think the jury's out on all of that. I think if GDPR is any example, I think that's probably not going to help on the innovation side, at least from coming from Europe. But again, we'll wait and see. And I think a lot of this culturally depends on sort of where you come from my perspective, a policy and regulatory perspective, but even, I guess, from a company perspective, engagement perspective. And this gets back to ex ante or ex post, right? Do you deal with something when something's out and there's a proven problem? Or do you try to look at something, map out all the possible potential things, and then decide whether to do it or not? And I think that probably goes for products as well. And you have to kind of decide what's your risk factor and what you're willing to do and not do. And a lot of that, I think, comes from culturally where you are. Western philosophy, a U.S. approach versus a European approach. They're very different. They're not the same. And I think companies have that same dynamic and where they fit in that.
Thanks. I'll just read out a comment that Avri did put into the chat. Frameworks plus impact assessments. So probably the combination of the two will yield some effective outcomes for sure. I don't see any questions online or in the room, so maybe just a quick sentence or two as a wrap up to sort of bring us to a close. I know everybody's got busy schedules, and if I can give you 10 minutes of your time back, I'm sure you'd appreciate it. You could probably use it to get in line to the restrooms before the rest of the sessions wrap up. So let's go to you, Charles. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think just this is such an important topic, and one that I think we need to move to very specific, good practices and frameworks that can be used across industry. And I'm really glad that Richard and the BSR team are doing that, for the industry, and that we sort of try to bring the whole industry along on this journey. It's not going to go away. It's going to get more and more complicated. There are going to be more unintended consequences or unforeseen utilizations of new technologies as the pace increases. And I'm excited that this is a space that continues to be a place where we can learn from each other, and build some sort of common understanding of how this is done well, so that our colleagues from civil society and academia are not being asked to provide input into things that don't go anywhere.
So, Toba Kelly, please.
Thanks a lot. I think my last reflection is really that I think going forward, I think we are open as Paradigm Initiative to engage as well as connect any product designers to the broader community on the African continent who are within our networks. And of course, the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum is going to be hosted in 2025 from 29 April to 1 May in Lusaka, Zambia. It's a multi-stakeholder platform, and we're looking forward to having at least 800 stakeholders from the Global South in attendance. So it would be a good platform to continue these conversations, and obviously a perfect platform as well for any policy consultations or any other product launches. And yeah, I think it's something that we look forward to, and we look forward to building lasting relationships as well with the private sector around human rights, so to speak. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Fiona?
I think my takeaway from all of this is that, it's important to always talk about, to anyone and everyone, the importance of getting stakeholder feedback. And I think we talk a lot about the successes of the processes, but the fact that sometimes it doesn't work, or it doesn't work and you don't release a product, we don't talk about that, right? So I think it's equally as important to talk about why things don't work, or if the outcome of the stakeholder feedback is not to release the product, making that known. Because the more transparent we can all be in all of this, I think the better it'll be for everyone.
Thank you. And Richard, you want to finish it off for us?
Yeah, I just want to kind of say as well that although there is still so much more to do, and it's right that expectations increase, and that demands on companies continue to be ones that call for them to do better. We are a lot further advanced than we were 10, 20 years ago in terms of this issue being one that's on the radar of companies and on the sophistication of existing efforts. There's huge variation still. There's an awful lot more to be done, and I think some of the criticisms have been sort of rightly called out today. But I do think it is something that companies are aware of and thinking about in a way that they weren't 10 plus years ago. And there are opportunities there to kind of to use that and to use other tools to increase what we do. So I hope that things will continue to improve, but there is, as you say, still a lot more to be done.
Great, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everybody who found our workshop room tucked over here in the corner, and also for those who joined online. And for our speakers, we're unfortunate you couldn't be here, but here in spirit and here in sight. And once again, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll enjoy the rest of your week.